Hello everyone, welcome to the Museum of Composite Propellant Hobby Rocketry. Today we're going to focus on several of the very important and interesting stories that we have here in the museum. And I'm going to ask Gary Rosenfeld, the founder and president of Aerotech, to take us through the museum. So I think, Gary, the best place to start is where it all started, right here with Irv Wade.
Well, we give Irv Wade a prominent position in the museum because he was the first person to make a composite propellant model rocket motor, hobby rocket motor. So there is some pictures of Irv, some copies of one of his catalogs from RDC, Rocket Development Corporation. We have the Enerjet 8 here, which was one of his first rocket motors that was sold. This is also a Whirlwind motor, which came much later. But Irv made these for another group. And then down below that, we have a J motor, an Enerjet J motor that was graciously donated by Dr. Pat Artis. And this was actually built by both Pat Miller and Dr. Artis together. And I think if you look at the date, it says, I think it's 1967. Roughly, so it's a pretty old artifact. After Irv produced these motors, he got the attention of Lee and Betty Peaster of Centuri Engineering, and Lee and Betty Peaster ended up buying the Irv Wade Enerjet technology and brought out what we call the Centuri Enerjet line, which was the first time it was actually mass marketed and labeled and packaged nicely for retail sale. There's a picture of Lee and Betty there, and we have a description of them. And Larry Brown was kind of their spokesman for a while, and that's him there launching one of their AeroDart rockets. That was at NARM 14 in 1972. There he is again in this picture, and that's Randy Gilbert in the background on the right, and Bob Del Principi's over on the left, kind of hidden behind somebody else.
So one of the areas that I think is one of the most interesting areas of the museum is the actual history and development of the Aerotech single-use composite propellant motor, for which we have an amazing collection here of the various samples that are related to the advancement of the composite propellant hobby rocket motor. So Gary, why don't you take us through some of the samples here?
Yeah, when Aerotech first started, the motors are quite a bit different than they are today. They used graphite nozzles, which were machined on a Swiss screw machine, and paper phenolic casings. So you see a lot of these here. A lot of these were made in the early to mid 80s. And I also have some descriptions of some of the very first operations in garages and little industrial facilities and so on. So we kind of graduated from this very labor-intensive method of manufacturing to the more recent manufacturing methods, which include molded cases with nozzles integral to the cases and so on. But back in the old days, it was very labor-intensive. We did have a very wide variety of different types of motors. In fact, the very smallest ones were made in cooperation with Art Rose for the U.S. Internats team. So there's several examples of that, and those were used for contests where we presumably won a number of events with those.
Of course, one of the most famous and well-known advancements that Aerotech has been known for is our RMS, Reloadable Motor System. And it also has quite an amazing history behind it. And again, we have some wonderful samples here in the museum to help tell that story.
Okay, so the RMS concept came from some work that Dan Meyer and I had done. He was an early partner in the company on some rocket motors that were used for parachute deployment on light aircraft. And we noticed when we were testing those motors, we could reuse the hardware over and over again. So we thought, well, maybe we could design a hobby rocket motor using that same technology. So we initially, after several years of work, we brought them out at, I believe it was LDRS 9 in Hartselle, Colorado. and there's a very early case there. We market them under the Industrial Solid Propulsion name, which was our commercial aerospace company division. Actually, it was a separate company, but we did that to kind of promote the idea that these were a very professionally designed and developed product. So you can see some of the very first ads we ran were for Industrial Solid Propulsion, which was the sister company to Aerotech. Later on, a few years later, we brought them out under the Aerotech name. And in fact, we came out with smaller versions down to a B motor, but 29, 24, and 18 millimeter motors using the reloadable motor technology. So you kind of see a little bit of a development and a progression here from the Industrial Solid Propulsion, eventually down to Aerotech here, and then it's matured from there.
Another terrific development and advancement that Gary and Aerotech has been responsible for is the DMS, or disposable motor system, where he introduced the ability to actually dial in your ejection charge. This was especially important for our rocket dealers, because instead of having to carry various rocket motors, each having a different time delay, they would only have to carry one item now that could be adjusted for several time delays. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I can. Unfortunately, I don't think I have any real examples here. There might be a few up here, but the disposable motor system was kind of an idea that came about from people commenting how perhaps our reloadable motors were more difficult than some of our competitors' motors, and that the hardware was more expensive or not. And so this was an idea of, well, let's just get rid of the hardware totally, but retain the advantages of some of the key features like adjustable delays and so on. So I think it was in 2012 where we first introduced the DMS, or disposable motor system. I think that was in Seattle, or maybe it was it was at a Narcon, I think, but now I can't remember where it was. But anyway, we started out with just a few motors, and the line has expanded. I can't even remember how many there are. There might be like 30,
Yeah.
something like that. It's quite a few. So we go all the way from a G motor on up to an O motor. In fact, the largest DMS motor is this one right here, the O5500, and that is a low O motor.
Gary has a favorite saying, which is that there's always a way. We have here what we call the Aerotech hybrid era that runs from about 1994 to 2009. And in order to keep hobby rocketry going, Aerotech was forced to look at other ways to stay involved with hobby rocketry, because at the time we were having some issues with the ATF and some other regulatory situations. So we have a great collection here of what was developed at that time in the hybrid era. You want to take us through that?
Yeah, we've got a display of Aerotech hybrids, a Hypertech hybrid, Ratworks, and let's see, there was another one, Skyripper Systems hardware. So all this kind of came about roughly around 1994 because of the ATF wanting to regulate high power rocketry very closely. And that lasted till roughly 2009, when the NAR in Tripoli won a lawsuit in federal court that basically took ammonium perchlorate composite propellant off the explosives list. But during that time, this was an alternative for people to fly some of the high power rocket motors without being burdened by ATF regulations. So one of the differences in some of these was everybody else used a plastic fuel. Aerotech used a cardboard fuel. And if you look at this motor here, you can see there's two separate cardboard fuel grains in there. And the cardboard actually burns very, very efficiently in a hybrid motor. So we were able to get a higher specific impulse from that than you could out of a plastic motor, which didn't have enough residence time or wasn't burning very efficiently in the motor. And it worked. It was a great system, and it had other advantages as well. But Aerotech was the first company to actually certify a hybrid system with the Tripoli Rocketry Association.
I've been involved in the model and hobby rocket industry for 56 years. for the first several decades, I always had questions of the relationship between the composite propellant side of the industry and the black powder side of the industry. And I now have a much better understanding of that, because the fact is that the principles involved back in the day, the real godfathers of this industry, were all friends. And we have a great picture, in fact, two different ones here in the museum. One right here showing Lee Peaster, Vern Estes, Irv Waite, and John Merkonen all together at a NORAM. And then just above us, and Nikki, if you want to pull back here, that same photo has 5 individuals up here in the lower left corner of the mural. And G. Harry Stein has joined the group at one of the early NORAMs. They were all friends, they knew each other, and so composite model and hobby rocketry has grown along with black powder model rocketry from nearly almost the very beginning. Yeah. It's a very special thing here in the museum. I had never seen this picture before, actually, until I joined Aerotech about 6 years ago. And now, there is also a relationship between the Estes Cineroc and the Centuri Interjet motor that greatly influenced Gary Rosenfield to eventually become one of the great model and hobby rocket manufacturers on the planet. You got to tell that story.
Oh boy. Well, when I got into model rocketry, there were no composite motors that I was aware of at the time, but I was flying Estes rockets, Estes motors. Found out about the Estes Cineroc, and that captured my imagination quite a bit. I was flying them with as many black powder motors as I could find. I mean, clustered, staged, and eventually went with Flight Systems F100s. And then when I found out about Enerjets, I started flying them on the Enerjet motors and 2-staging them, 3-staging them, clustering them, and it just kept me involved, kept me interested long enough so that when it came about that I became interested in model rocket motor, or manufacturing the composite rocket motors, and this was right around the time Enerjet was going out of business, kind of propelled me into that line of thinking and that goal to get into business. So I hope I described it well enough.
Yeah, that's terrific. Another special place, one of my favorites in the entire museum, has to do with our honoring of Paul Hans. Paul was a partner of Gary's, a financial advisor, an individual involved in the aerospace industry, a long-time model rocket industry friend, just an absolutely terrific person. But one of the things a lot of people don't know about Paul is that back in the day, as a young model rocketeer in Massachusetts, he and his pal, Don Scott, were the first rocketeers to fly an 8mm movie camera on board a model rocket. That was an amazing achievement back in the day. And here in the museum, thanks to Paul's family, we have the actual camera that was used on that rocket, and in fact, the 8mm movie film that was taken at that time. Eventually, as we develop our virtual tour video, we will actually be showing a digital clip of that film in our museum tour video. Did you want to say anything else?
I think we kind of need to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, there are a couple other crazy things here in the museum. The first one, if you look up here, there is a raw turkey sitting on the top of a very large high-power rocket, and you got to tell the turkey rocket story.
Well, that was a rocket built by Gary Bird, and somehow he got hooked up with the Mark and Brian show. It was a very popular radio show in Los Angeles, and they went to do a stunt to launch a raw turkey right around, I think it was right around Thanksgiving time, on a rocket. And he built this thing, I built the motor. We all went out to Lucerne Dry Lake, and there was the largest crowd of people I've ever seen out there. It was probably 3,000 to 5,000 people showed up from all over Southern California to to watch this fly. And the flight was successful. Then they displayed the rocket in the Lucerne parade, I think the next day. And then the story goes that the turkey was actually cooked and fed to homeless people or in
a homeless shelter. Yeah.
Later on. So wasn't wasted.
So we will wrap up the presentation with another incredibly interesting aerial display of the rocket through the tire. And again, I'm going to turn it back over to Gary to tell that story because he was in attendance at the time.
Yeah, that was a rocket launched by Pius Morizumi. It was at Black Rock Desert, and about 1993. And this was he was prepping this thing. It was a two-stage rocket, prepping on a table just behind the flight line where the cars were parked. And I guess he had a mercury switch to stage it, and somehow something got jostled. The upper stage ignited. It took off a table, bounced on the ground, and then impaled itself in that tire that was mounted to a vehicle, and it burned like for 10 seconds. So that was actually the safest place for that rocket to go, and that ended up becoming a display in Skeeky Courtney's front yard. Skeeky was Bruno Selmy's daughter, and that was in their yard for almost 30 years until Carl Bauman and I found out that she was selling her house, and we decided to talk to her about the idea of putting this in our museum that was coming up, and instead of, maybe ended up being a landfill somewhere if the new owners didn't want it. So she graciously allowed us to remove it from her yard, and we've now installed it as a permanent museum piece for everybody to see, and hopefully be there for a long, long time.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this relatively short topical presentation of our Museum of Composite Propellant Hobby Rocketry. We're open Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. If you come near the area of Cedar City, Utah, and southern Utah, please stop by and take a look at the museum and say hello. Thank you so much for joining us.